Today, I want to look at the case of the Los Angeles Alliance for Human Rights versus the City of Los Angeles through a legal philosophical lens. And so, for some background, California has always had a homelessness problem. Despite it being the richest state in the nation, hundreds of thousands of people lay outside on any given night in California because they cannot afford or do not have access to shelter. And if we narrow our scope a bit further and just look at Los Angeles, we see people in dire need. And so this case was brought up in March of 2020 amidst the COVID-19 crisis. And this specifically affects homeless people everywhere, because of the pandemic, a lot of public facilities had to close, and these facilities are where houseless people would get their supplies or reach resources that one may have in their home or may have easier access to, which they do not. And so in March of 2020, the Los Angeles Alliance for Human Rights filed a complaint in the U.S. State's District Court raising multiple concerns with the city of Los Angeles' treatment of homeless people living on Skid Row. The city was towing people's vehicles, which was a problem because a lot of homeless people live in their cars as well. They were giving people parking tickets for parking on the street. The city was seizing people's property during street cleanups, and taking them to a warehouse in which they could not access their items because of the COVID-19 pandemic. And lastly, LA Alliance for Human Rights also states that the amount of public hygiene stations in the city is not proportional to the size of the homeless population. And these facilities weren't even open all day, which further restricts homeless people's access to hygiene. Department of Public Social Services also announced they'd close their Los Angeles offices and move in light of the pandemic. But these offices are where many homeless Angelenos found relief. They provided food stamps, EBT cards, and a place for people to pick up their mail. And so a lot of things that homeless people, or a lot of places in which homeless people would find help, were closing down or just becoming more a problem than a help. So overall, the Los Angeles Alliance for Human Rights was fighting for the stop of the further criminalization and marginalization of houseless people in Los Angeles. After trying to reach a settlement with the county, they failed to do so, and so on April 20th, 2021, Judge David O. Carter presided over this case and ordered a preliminary injunction. He ordered the city and the county of Los Angeles to offer shelter to all unaccompanied women and children living on Skid Row by July 2021. He ordered the city and county of Los Angeles to offer shelter to all families living in Skid Row by August 18th of 2021, and said that the rest of the general homeless population should be housed by October of 2021. And the largest order, which I think was what sent it to the appeals court, was that the city of Los Angeles was to place $1 billion in escrow to basically plan for solving this homelessness issue. Now this order was written in just the last few pages of his over 100-page injunction, and in most of that injunction, Judge Carter basically laid out the reason for homelessness in Los Angeles and cited its immense impacts on Black Angelenos. He basically outlines a history of structural racism, which was the biggest force in creating the homelessness crisis that we see in Los Angeles today. After this ruling, Los Angeles County brought this case to the appeals court, saying that it was basically absurd that he would order them to pay that much money and solve this problem so quickly. And the panel of the U.S. Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals determined that Judge Carter abused his discretion and did not have authority to issue the preliminary injunction. They stated that he had unpled claims and overstepped his boundaries. Now, of course, these unpled claims are his extensive examination of the history of structural racism in Los Angeles and America in general. And the Ninth Circuit did not believe that this matched the original claim that was brought to the court, that the Los Angeles City of Alliance initially argued that the county's inaction caused a dangerous space for houseless people. This was the last advancement made in the case, and this was ruled in September of 2021. So now I would like to look into the different legal theories that you can see playing a factor in this case. And so I think one of the biggest ones is interpretivism and legal realism, the biggest two, I guess. Interpretivism and legal realism. And so, as we can see, he has a lot of bias in his preliminary injunction. He acknowledges it, the role he plays as a judge, and using his kind of natural law approach in what law ought to be, he shows that he wants to use his position to make change rather than pushing the problem along. This kind of aligns with Dworkin's naturalist approach in his theory of interpretivism. And I think he has a really interesting passage which aligns kind of well with this case. In his piece, Natural Law Revisited, he outlines his way of thinking through different writers passing on a novel and adding chapters as they go. And he begs the question, what is the difference between continuing the novel in the best way possible by writing plot and development that can be seen to flow from what has gone before, and starting a fresh novel with characters having the same names? And he says, a naturalist judge would be forced to reject a politically attractive interpretation, we suppose, simply because he did not believe it fit the record well enough. And I think Judge Carter is that natural judge he is referencing. He cites the previous political and legal strategies used to go against poor people in Los Angeles, and more specifically Black people in Los Angeles, and says that he doesn't want to continue this line of action or this trend in the legal world in which we suppress the voices of houseless people. And I think lining him up with a naturalist approach is better than lining him up with a natural law approach, because I think in natural law, specifically in the readings that we covered in class, the higher moral ground that it's supposed to be rooted in is usually referenced to be God, and I don't think Carter is referencing that in this point. I think it is more his personal biases and his belief that housing and basically shelter should be a right for people, and what Los Angeles has done in structurally oppressing poor people is completely wrong. I think woven into this approach, you can also see how critical race theory takes play in this. And critical race theory, as we kind of covered in class, it kind of looks at the structural oppression that people go through and cite not only individuals for this issue, but the political and legal system that is currently standing as a large body of white supremacy, basically oppressing different marginalized groups. And like I said before, he cites these claims of systemic oppression and the group being the government not acknowledging the rights of houseless people. On the other hand, I think the Ninth Circuit takes more of a positive approach, aligning maybe more with Antonin Scalia's version of interpretation or interpretivism. And they say that he overstepped his boundaries and that there's, I guess, not enough legal precedent for him to do this. And I think it's interesting that they kind of dismiss what he said as unpled claims, and kind of highlighting, I guess, an aspect of critical legal studies. What is the norm, and how does that norm govern how we make legal decisions? Robert Gordon, an author we read in class, talked about how our legal system isn't objective or neutral, and it is a reflection of the dominant political ideology that we're living in. And in his interpretation of this, he basically says that our application of law is always biased, and in looking at it as being unbiased or from a neutral standpoint, we fail to see the different positions that judges and lawmakers can take. The dominant ideology, I believe, in this case is white supremacy, and more specifically, the classism and racism that fall under white supremacy. Judge Carter's preliminary injunction does not align with that dominant ideology, and of course he is only one person within our system, so when he has taken up a deviant approach to looking at this case, the higher-ups said no. Now, some may see this as a kind of positive effect of naturalism, the fact that a judge is using his discretion to better the lives of houseless people in Los Angeles. However, there was a lot of kickback on his injunction. Kickback not only from business owners and people who lived in the downtown area near Skid Row, but also houseless people. By placing such a tight restriction on when the city could come up with money, they would have to take some of this money from Prop HHH efforts, which where Prop HHH is basically an effort that Los Angeles is going through to build more affordable housing. However, it is going so slowly. It was passed years ago, but only 7% of the project is done, and it doesn't seem as if it will take any shorter of an amount of time to finish. And Judge Carter, I think, thought this was okay because he wanted to shelter people immediately. However, in saying that the city had mere months to find a place for houseless people to stay, they wouldn't be prioritizing long-term affordable housing, and these shelters are not the primary choice of houseless people to stay in. Temporary housing and shelter would mean that homeless people would not be allowed to bring their pets, and a lot of homeless people have pets as emotional support because this lifestyle is extremely hard to live. Many shelters are single-sex or sex-segregated facilities, and so if a houseless person were to have a partner, they would have to be separated in order to live in these shelters. And these shelters also don't allow houseless people to bring in all of their possessions. And of course, these possessions are very close to their hearts because this is what they've used to survive for so long. In addition to this, they have lots of rules about curfews, and they may be located too far from where somebody gets those free resources for mailing things and applying for jobs and just having the other basic needs to live. It kind of just makes it hard for houseless people to build a life. I guess this kind of shows how naturalism is also not reliable, because relying on one person's judgment will often not produce the best results. And he intended to help, but his version of help is obviously biased by his class and him not understanding the implications of rushing this process. I think there's a long way to go in solving the houselessness crisis in Los Angeles, but I think it starts at offering affordable housing and identifying the root of this problems, which he tried to do, but I guess failed to, possibly because he didn't believe he could order them to build affordable housing instead. But nevertheless, that is the big issue. The living wage, the price of living in Los Angeles is nowhere near the minimum wage, and the prices just keep rising and rising. And of course, due to the pandemic, it's just a worsening problem. People need to be paid a living wage and have access to housing that is not for people that are at a middle class status or up, because that leaves everyone else struggling to pay for this housing that's not affordable for them at all. And I think Judge Carter's preliminary injunction and his outline of the history of structural racism is a start to this. And I think by further using a critical race theory lens, maybe another judge or a legislator can actually get to the root of this problem and not only provide more housing, but provide more money for the people who are struggling to make ends meet.